So one of the ways that Jesus was understood was as a teacher or as a rabbi. So a little bit of a background on what rabbis were. Rabbis back in the days were these itinerant teachers. They would travel around and they would have these groups of followers that would follow after them called Talmudim. Talmud in Hebrew just means learner. So these rabbis would invite these groups of students or these followers to go with them as they travel from place to place and do their teaching. So what's important to understand is that rabbis all have different interpretations of Scripture, right? They all believe that God gave the 5 books to Moses, and God gave these laws to Moses. But how those laws were lived out and what the interpretation of those laws were differed from rabbi to rabbi. And those interpretations of the rabbi was called their yoke. So if you followed a rabbi, or if you were invited to follow a rabbi, what you would do is you would take the rabbi's yoke on you, and you would learn what the rabbi knew and do what the rabbi did. So that's the setting when Jesus enters into the story in the Bible. Is people were used to these itinerant teachers who had different interpretations and would invite you to follow them. So with that, let's look at Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 through 22. It says, while walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Immediately they left their nets and followed him. And going on from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Okay, so the rabbi calls them, "Take my yoke," and they left everything and followed him. Now, let's imagine a little bit about how ridiculous the situation is. Let's put ourselves in their place. Imagine you're doing your job, whatever your job may be. Maybe you're a teacher, maybe you do office work, maybe you do manual labor. I don't know what your job is, but whatever your job is, you're in the middle of doing your job, and this rabbi, this teacher of the law, comes by and just says, "Come, follow me." And you drop everything, right? And you drop what you're doing, and you just get up and you go. That's crazy, right? You quit your job, you leave your family, you leave the thing that you've been training for. If you're a fisherman back then, this is your family business. You've grown up around this. You've been trained your whole life to do this, and you leave and you follow this man with no guarantees. There's no guarantee that following this man will lead to any sort of success. There's no guarantee that following this man will enable you to support yourself financially, but yet you follow him and you leave everything behind. And so this year, as one of our sermon series, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And not so much like why did they leave everything to follow him, but what does it look like afterwards, now that you've left your job? Now that you've committed to this person's teachings, now that you've committed to this person's life, what does it look like to follow Jesus? Because maybe this was really normal back in the days. Maybe fishermen just left their job when someone called them to leave. But what does that look like today? What does it look like in our workplaces to be a follower of Jesus? Now that we live in a world where back then maybe the idea of spirituality was more normal, but now we live in a world that's more postmodern or more humanism. What does it look like today now to follow Jesus in a world that has very different worldviews, very different understandings of what life should look like? Okay, so the material we're going to go through, just for clarity, is coming from a discipleship program that someone pointed me to called Practicing the Way. Okay, so you can look it up. So if you don't like what I'm saying, you can look at the website, okay? Practicing the Way. All the sermon notes, all those things for the most part are from there. And I'm not big on programs, but I do see their value, right? I did Purpose-Driven Life when it first came out, and even though, it's like, okay, I'm not big on programs, I think it did do something. So the question we're trying to answer for the first part of this year is, what does it look like to be a follower of Jesus? Because whether we know it or not, we are all followers of something. We are all disciples of somebody. We're all formed by some idea or some person's message that gets into our brain, into our hearts, and it eventually kind of lives itself out in our life. Right? What I find so appropriate is an Instagram. What is the button you press when you are interested in being a disciple of someone? Follow. Right? You press the follow button. And I realize there's different levels of Instagram following. There's people that we follow in Instagram just because they're entertaining and we want something brainless and we just want some quick information. And so we'll scroll. Oh, that seems interesting. I'll follow. There's that very low level following. And then there's people that we follow because we have some relationship with them. Maybe we follow our family members or we follow our friends because we are genuinely interested in what is happening in their lives. And Instagram happens to be the way that people communicate what is going on in their lives at the moment. So there's low-level following of like, this is interesting. There's a deeper level following of this is someone that I associate with, someone I have a relationship with, someone that is near and dear to me. And then there's another level of following where we tend to follow these people that are, what I'll say, gurus or rabbis of our day. And what do they teach? They teach life hacks. They teach exercise methods. They teach ways to live that will revolutionize the way your life goes. Okay, so in our household, one of the things that we follow on Instagram and we get discipled by in Instagram maybe is minimalism. There's people on Instagram that teach you how to be a minimalist, have less things in your house, to throw away things, okay? Amen, Marie Kondo, if you know who that is, right? Other people, they teach travel hacks. How do you get the most out of your travel itinerary? How do you pack well? How do you get the most out of this location, right? Or there's people that are into how to invest in stocks. And you follow them because you value their message and you believe in what they say and you trust their methods in investing in stocks, right? That's something I follow, some people I'm discipled by. Or maybe you agree with people's political views and you ascribe to them and you like their ideas. And you, in some way, pattern your life to reflect their message. So the reason I'm pointing this out is I just want us to recognize that we are all in some ways being discipled by someone. Maybe for us, it's the books we read, that we really like The Tipping Point, or all these other very famous popular books. And we try to live our lives in the way that was prescribed in these books or in something we've seen in Instagram or some other influencer. We are all discipled by something. But we all follow someone. And so, again, the question I want to ask is, what does that look like in terms of being discipled by and following, not an Instagram influencer, but Jesus? The word follower in the Bible is often translated as disciple. But that's actually not a good word. A better word is apprentice. Okay, because I think that lands a little bit better in us, right? So what is an apprentice? An apprentice is someone who learns from the master, who observes the master, who does what the master does. So an apprentice learns by watching and being with the master. This is how carpentry works. If you want to be a carpenter, you come under the apprenticeship of another carpenter, and they show you how to do things, and you probably spend the first bit of time just watching them. And then they ease you into it, and then you help them, and then you do a little bit more and a little bit more. And throughout the years, you become an expert carpenter yourself. So what does it look like to be a follower of Jesus? What does the apprenticeship of following this rabbi mean for us? So if you were a rabbi back in the day, you had 3 goals. The first goal was this: to be with your rabbi. If you were a follower of a rabbi, your first goal was to be with your rabbi. You would follow them all the time. You would be with them 24/7 because discipleship and apprenticeship was not about information transfer, it was relational. And so you can't have a relationship with someone unless you are with them. And there was this saying back in the days that evolved because as you were walking with your rabbi, the area was really dusty. And you would be walking behind them, and the saying evolved that said, "May you be covered in the dust of your rabbi." And that was a blessing. May you be covered in the dust of your rabbi. Meaning, may you be so close to your teacher, to your rabbi, that you walk so close behind them that their dust, as they walk, literally covers you. So first goal is to be with your rabbi. Second goal is to be like your rabbi. You would try to imitate their entire life. You would, in fact, start talking like them. You would imitate their mannerism. So right now, my kid, who I try not to preach about, but it's a great illustration, so too bad, he starts speaking very differently. He's entering his teenage years where he becomes annoying and unbearable, right? And boarding school comes into my mind. But he starts speaking differently. Why is he speaking differently? Because he is spending time with friends who speak differently. He's being discipled in an indirect way by his friends, and he's becoming like his friends. So it's the same thing back then. If you want to be a disciple of a rabbi, you're going to start talking like them naturally because you've spent time with them. You're going to start thinking like them. You're going to start adopting their mannerisms. Right? And the third goal is this, to do as your rabbi did. That's deeper. So it's not just spending time. It's not just copying what they're like, but it's actually to do the stuff they do. What did Jesus say to the fishermen? I will make you fishers of men. To us, that sounds really corny, right? Like fishers of men. But back then, that was actually a really normal saying. And what the rabbi is saying is, as I am a fisher of men, as I get followers, I'm going to train you to also be a fisher of men, as someone who gets followers. So your goal as a disciple of the rabbi is not just to know the stuff the rabbi knows, but to do the stuff the rabbi does. That's what it means to follow Jesus. Believe it or not, if you don't know, my profession right now is a math teacher, and I was actually a master teacher. I would train student teachers how to be a teacher, okay? And this is exactly what we did. They would spend time with me. They would see how I do things. They would see how I plan a lesson. They would watch me teach. I would model for them how to address classroom management issues. I would model for them how to sequence a lesson, how to build in breaks, how to prompt students with proper questions, how to check for understanding. I would model very clearly with my student teachers, here's what it looks like to teach. And that couldn't happen without them spending time with me. But then secondly, because they're kind of new, and until they found their own voice, they would just kind of mimic what I do, right? And so one of the things that I would do if the class is kind of rowdy, I would just stand to the side and just wait. And then the students get really uncomfortable because, why is the teacher not talking? And they would all quiet down. And then I would wait for 10, I would count to 10 in my head after they quieted down. Why? Because students need to get used to the silence. Because I knew if I started talking right away, they're going to start talking right away. So we get this uncomfortable silence. For 10 seconds, I would count 1, 2, in my head, right? This teacher trick, don't tell any people, okay? Right? I'll just say, I'll wait. And so what did my student teachers do? They would say, I'll wait. And sometimes they would start talking right away, and I would correct them. I say, no. After they quiet down, count to 10 in your head, because they have to get used to the silence, right? And so over time, they would pick up my mannerisms, the way I would use proximity, the way I would ask specific questions, all these things. And eventually, what did I do? I released them to be teachers. And they got to do what I do without me being there guiding and watching over them. That's exactly what it looks like today. That's what it looked like back then. And I think to some extent, this is what it really looks like to practically follow Jesus. We are meant to do what the rabbi did. Jesus healed, we're meant to heal. Okay, however you want to interpret that. Jesus preached the word, we're meant to preach the word. However you want to interpret that. Okay? We are meant to do what the rabbi did. So what is a disciple? Dallas Willard says it this way. You're going to get a lot of Dallas Willard quotes today. A disciple is a learner, a student, an apprentice. But here's what's important. A practitioner. The disciples of Jesus are people who do not just profess certain views as their own by applying their growing understanding of the life of the kingdom of heaven to every aspect of their life on earth, right? It's not just you profess certain views, you actually apply it. You do it. You're a practitioner, not just a learner. Okay, so here's what I'll say. The goal of following a rabbi and the goal of following Jesus is not about information, but transformation. It does us no good to just understand the rabbi's theology. It does us no good to just learn the teachings of the rabbi. That's not the goal of discipleship or apprenticeship. The goal is not to learn things, but to become someone. The goal is not to get to transfer information from one person to another. The goal is transformation. Using that information, using their life as a way to transform who we are. In Christianese, that word is called spiritual formation. Spiritual formation is just this process where we become more and more like Christ, where our life transforms from who we are, that's us-centered, to someone who is more God-centered. Again, Dallas Willard says it this way: spiritual formation in a Christian tradition answers the specific human question. So I want you to ask this question to yourself. What kind of person am I going to be? What kind of person I am going to be? It is the process of establishing the character of Christ in that person. That's all it is. Discipleship is forming us away from who we are and more into how Christ is. That's the process. But here's the question we're going to answer this year. How does that happen? How does that practically happen? Okay? How do we become more Christ-like? How do we move from more self-centered to Christ-centered? Luke chapter 6, verse 40 says this: a disciple is not above his teacher. Okay, why? Because the disciple is there to learn from the teacher. Look at this. But everyone, when he is fully what? Trained, will be like his teacher. If we want to be like Christ, if we want to do the things Christ does, it takes training. It is a process. We don't become like Jesus the moment we get saved. Training does not just happen once a week on Sunday, right? Training is actually this daily, lifelong commitment we make to be involved in this process of becoming more and more like Him. It's intentional. So here's how I'll say it. Training, why is it hard though? Because training requires time, which we don't have, investment, which we are kind of scared to give into, habit building, which some of us are not good at, a lifetime being with, being like, and doing the same things as our teacher. Training requires time. Training requires investment. So there's one aspect of Christianity that I think is, yeah, you spend time with Christ, but there's an intentionality to what we do with what we learn and what God does in us that I think sometimes we lack, right? Spiritual formation is not going to come just from, I don't know, like some experience. Spiritual formation comes from the habits we develop and participate in as we see our rabbi does that. Let's go back to the Instagram situation, right? If you want to be a really good minimalist in your home, you're going to need to develop daily habits that enable you to do that. It's not going to happen by accident. Or let's take a more, something I thought of this morning. Anyone remember Daniel Schreiber? Okay, if you want to be buff like Daniel Schreiber, okay, if you've ever, that man once ate 5 meals during small group. But anyway, if you want to be as buff as Daniel Schreiber, you don't just buy his app. You don't just listen to Daniel Schreiber's teachings. You don't just watch Daniel work out on Instagram. You don't just do that. You build in your life habits that Daniel shows you in order to become more like him, although I don't think any of us will ever have that chance, but okay? But if you wanted to, right, you build intentional habits, intentional exercise, set aside intentional time during the day to become more and more like Him. So following Jesus is not just about agreeing to His teachings. That's easy. I can agree to everything Jesus says about love and the world and all these things. It's not just about knowing what He knows, but it's actually looking at His life practices. So if we could go to the slide with the, I think it's 8. So here are some of the things our rabbi practiced in his lifetime. He practiced solitude, generosity. He read Scripture. He was in community. He practiced Sabbath, prayer, fasting, service. So what we're going to do is we're going to take 4 weeks at a time to look at these specific practices, and we're going to do some of the things that our rabbi did. But we also want to understand why. Like, is it descriptive or is it prescriptive? In other words, is the Bible just telling us, oh, Jesus did this thing? Or is the Bible telling us, Jesus did this thing, you should do it too? So we're going to have to kind of wrestle with that a little bit, right? So Jesus fasted. Should we fast? He fasted 40 days. Should we fast 40 days? I actually know a church in Hong Kong, the beginning of every year, they start a 21-day fast every year. Every time they make a big decision, they do a fast. Should we do the same? And what if this is actually what it takes to build the habits? These are the habits that it takes to be a follower of Jesus. Will we still do it? Because this is not easy. It's easy as a graphic. It's easy to distill to 8 things. There's actually a 9th thing, but the website is working on it. But in practice, is it actually easy? That's the question. So I just want to end with this. I want to think about, why did the fishermen so willingly get up, leave everything behind, and follow Jesus? Why were they so willing to follow Jesus? Was he that compelling of a figure? Was he that good of a teacher? Maybe yes, but I think to understand part of the reason why they left everything to follow Jesus, we have to understand the Jewish school system of the day. So the Jewish school system of the day, the center of all the teaching was the Torah, right? The first 5 books of the Old Testament. The foundation of their lives, the focus of their whole educational system was to learn the Torah. So there were 3 phases. Okay, so I'll put it this way. So the first phase of learning the Torah was called Beth Sefer. Okay, Beth Sefer, translated as house of the book, typically was from ages 6 to 10. So when you were at that age, you would memorize the entire Torah. The first 5 books of the Old Testament memorized. They're a very oral culture. They didn't necessarily write everything down. So a child at age 10 was expected to have memorized the whole first 5 books of the Old Testament. Okay, pretty crazy, right? Pretty crazy. But by the end of this, age 10, a lot of kids were not going to school, but instead they were apprenticing, learning the family trade, learning the family business, learning how to manage a household. So this is where the fishermen would have started learning how to be a fisherman at age 10. However, the best of the best, if you were a top 10% student, A-plus student, honor roll, okay, you would move on to what's called Beth Talmud, translated as house of study. This was the best of the best. This is Harvard, okay? So if you made it that far, you would actually memorize the rest of Hebrew scriptures, Genesis to Malachi. That's crazy, right? None of that seems appealing. But the best of the best of the best, the best of the best of the best, the elite students, the ones that would reject Harvard and instead go to Taida, okay? You could apply to a specific rabbi to be their disciple. So only, not even the best of the best, only the best of the best of the best could apply to be a follower of a rabbi and take on their yoke. Now let's think back. What were they doing when Jesus came by? Why did they drop everything? What were they doing? Fishing. Meaning what? They didn't make it. Right? They had to go through the first phase, because every Jewish child did that, but at some point they dropped out. They weren't top 10%. They weren't accepted to Harvard. They couldn't move on. They weren't good enough. Now think about that. Now this teacher comes along, this rabbi comes along and says, follow me. What are they doing? They're fast-tracking you to that last phase, the best of the best of the best. So of course, if a rabbi calls you after you've been deemed a failure academically, you're going to jump at that chance. Now, the honest truth is, we are not worthy to follow Jesus. We're not capable of following Jesus without the help of the Holy Spirit. But I want us to see that God, if you're in this room and if you're a believer, has in some way invited you to follow him. But you know what's crazy? In the New Testament, people were invited by this rabbi, and some still rejected. Some still said, I'm not going to follow. The rich young ruler said, I can't do this. And there were people that's like, wait a minute, Jesus, let me bury my father. Or wait, Jesus, let me first say goodbye to my family. There were people that said no. There were people that rejected the invitation of a rabbi to be the best of the best of the best. So the reason I bring that up is I want us to know that that's going to be the choice we're going to have to make on a daily basis as we kind of go through some of these practices. Because it's going to be an inconvenience to fast. It's going to be an inconvenience to practice generosity. There are going to be times where it feels like an intrusion on what you want to do. We're going to have to answer every day, am I still willing to follow this rabbi who has invited me through grace to follow him and through the Holy Spirit to be able to actually grow and succeed in following? That's the choice. Do you know how many people in the West call themselves Christians? Like 60-some%. How many are actually disciples? How many are actually followers? Very little. Very little, right? My last Dallas Willard quote says, the greatest issue facing the world today with all its heartbreaking needs is whether those who, by profession or culture, some people will say they're followers, some people are followers because the culture around them are followers or they grew up that way, are identified as Christians, will they become disciples? That's the biggest question. Students, apprentices, practitioners of Jesus Christ, steadily learning from him how to live the life of the kingdom of heaven into every corner of human existence. If we did this, if Christians did this, I guarantee a lot of the world's problems will not be problems. A lot of things that we think that's the biggest issue will be solved. If people who actually say they're followers of the rabbi actually follow the rabbi. And that's a choice we're going to have to make. Every day, when things get hard, when we don't want to do it, when we don't want to follow, that's a choice we have to make. I'm just going to end with this. Remember, when you take the rabbi's teachings, you take on their yoke. Right? Take on their yoke. And so I'm going to read from the Message paraphrase, Message paraphrase, that verse that comes from Matthew 11:29. Here's what it says. Here's what Jesus says. Instead of take my yoke upon you, right? He says, walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. That's all Jesus is saying. Walk with me, be with me, and work with me, right? Do the things that I do. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. So by way of reflection and connecting, if you're new here, haven't been here a while, one of the things we value is I don't think it's good to just hear a message and then walk away. It's good to process in community. Okay, so we like to spend a few minutes to share and discuss and kind of wrestle and pray together. So the things I just want us to think about, and again, this is all from the discipleship program, is as you look back in your life, who or what has had the greatest impact on your spiritual journey so far? It could be a person, a rabbi figure maybe, an opportunity, an event, could be whether a good or bad event, or some season. Right, so what has had the greatest impact on your spiritual journey? And the reason I ask this is as we think about building habits, right, maybe there are moments that have big impact, but I want us to consider, are there more intentional daily practices that could build impact? Okay? And then second, what do you think is the driving aim of your life, your top goals and priorities? Okay, that's just unpacking a little bit about what we prioritize. So a little bit disconnected, but really setting us up for things in the future. Okay, so let me pray, and then I'm going to ask us to just connect.